research here at Emily Carr University. But before I begin, I want to start by acknowledging the traditional, ancestral, unceded, and current territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations, on which I'm logging in from, and in which Emily Carr is currently situated on. I also know that we're all zooming in and logging in from various parts of Canada and also parts of the world. So let's use this opportunity as well to sort of reflect on the land that you're currently on. So it is my sincere joy and pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Anuradha Vikram, who is our 7th speaker, I believe, as part of our Contingencies of Care session. And Anuradha is going to present on the talk called The Season of the Witch, Metaphysics of Care and Repair in Contemporary Art. I first came across Anuradha's work through her writing for several years, but then last summer was able to sort of participate in a similar residency and was just completely floored by this lecture around Federici's notion of witchcraft as a form of redress, right? And a little context in terms of Anuradha's professional background. She's an LA-based writer, curator, and educator, and currently a co-curator for the upcoming Pacific Standard Time Art Science LA exhibition, Atmosphere of Sound, Sonic Art in Times of Climate Disruption, which opens in 2024, and is a guest curator for the upcoming Craft Contemporary. Her book, Decolonizing Culture, Essays on the Intersection of Art and Politics, is a collection of 17 essays that address questions of race and gender parity, which was published in 2017. And Anuradha is currently a faculty member at both UCLA and USC Roski School of Art and Design. She has directed exhibitions, led programs, led various mid-sized nonprofit institutions across the US, and has published countless articles and curated countless solo exhibitions. I'm not gonna read every detail because there's just too much. But what I wanna kind of mull over is this notion of perhaps thinking about this idea of staying power, or also thinking about this mix between institutional reform and institutional disobedience. In a recent article that Anuradha has written about, I think it was an Extra magazine in 2020, she wrote about David Hammons, Isaac Julian, and Fred Wilson, sort of pontificating and think about legacy and also thinking about institutional change. Let me read this one final quote. Perhaps the staying power of these artists lie in their unwillingness to be standard bearers for a racial, gendered, or otherwise identity-based politics that in art often functions as a kind of low-budget symbolic reparations, while money connected to board members at art institutions continues to flow into new and more terrifying atrocities. Rather than refuse to participate in this circus outright, many of these artists court attention only to reject it publicly as a false currency. So I think we're in this kind of moment of reckoning, but also a moment of redress, where artists and practitioners have to sort of think about rerouting this sort of circuit of multicultural kind of symbolic significance, and to think about change in more honest and careful ways, hence this idea of contingencies of care. And I'm honored and thrilled that Anuradha is joining us to sort of help us mull over this idea of witchcraft, which I think is a nice counter and perhaps a corrective in thinking about these issues of race and change and difference. With that said, I'm going to pass it to Anuradha, who can talk about her lecture, but also help inspire us to think about change and to think about creative production more broadly. So everyone, let's give Anuradha a big welcome.
Thank you so much, Stephen. That was a lovely introduction, and it reminds me why we do residencies. So let me start there. Many of the organizational programs that I have run have been residency based. and research-based. I frequently work with colleges and universities, not only as a professor, but also as a programmer. And I also have worked with a number of residency programs, including the Headlands Center for the Arts and also 18th Street Art Center here in the LA area. I do want to acknowledge that I also am a resident, right? I'm a resident of Los Angeles, which means that I am always a guest of the indigenous people who in this community are known as the Tongva Gabrieleño. Some take the name Kish, and there's also the Chumash, who have a strong presence in this area, and many other tribes and communities that I'm not mentioning. So I think that it's incredibly important, and it's really grounding for us to consider ourselves as residents in this way, right? And so a lot of what I talk about in my coursework is around citizenship and subjecthood, you know, who does a place belong to, right? And here in North America, in these settler colonial systems that we continue to live within, how do we share space with others when we don't really have a moral right to be here, and yet we have an ethical necessity? So this is where I think I've started to understand more, learn more, and think more around differences of thought. So I'll get into this maybe in more detail later, or maybe I won't. I don't want to get too explicit, but I'm going to just say that my understanding of witchcraft as an idea is really a conceptual one. And it's less about, say, making candles, although of course I love a good candle, but it's about how we function within and without systems that exist. So where Silvia Federici really makes a lot of sense to me is in how she shows us in her analysis in Caliban and the Witch that women's knowledge is both commodified and criminalized simultaneously through the process of colonization. And it's a process that happens parallel to the colonization and criminalization of people of color, communities of color, whether those are neighboring communities in Europe or later communities farther afield that Europeans traveled to with the intention of economic and later political conquest. So all of these different forms of knowledge are like shadow knowledges in a sense, where there's elements of them, for example, that enter into medical practice or religious ritual or political legitimacy, other ways of being visible to the dominant culture, and other aspects of the same practice that are not differentiated by the practitioners, but the dominant culture differentiates them, so that some are acceptable and some now are not inaccessible, right? And other modes of knowledge are no longer acceptable, nor are they accessible to those who live under that regime. So what witchcraft really is here is self-determination. Self-determination by the people who aren't supposed to be in charge. Witches are therefore agents of change. They're usually, but not exclusively, women. They're often associated with non-normative gendered behavior. So women who live alone, women who have money, women who assert themselves in courts of law. If we think back to the Crucible, for example, in the Salem witch trials, a lot of the original legal cases that were brought, there was in fact a connection between the women who were being charged and the person who was doing the charging, alleging of witchcraft, who was someone who had a financial interest in, say, appropriating their property, right? The widow on the lot next door who's giving me a hard time about the fact that I want to encroach on her field. If I say that she's a witch and she has all her assets seized, then I can bid on them. And that becomes my farmland, right? So there's an incentive here to disempower women who might have the kind of social financial clout to politically combat a patriarchal society. And of course, remember, the Americas in that period, especially where I am, in the United States, was very, not only Christian and settler in its origin, but really very puritanical, right? And so there was, there's a variety of ways that colonization has been enacted, but the puritanical one is extremely violent in terms of its enforcement of social conformity, differing from a lot of other ways of engaging, right? And so here, what I think a lot of artists and thinkers are trying to do is to break through that rigidity, to bring acceptance of levels of knowledge, communities of knowledge, and how the official knowledge and the unofficial knowledge actually serve and complement and inform one another. So that's really what I want to talk about today. And I'll say in passing for my intro as the kind of conclusion that the exhibition that I'm curating, there are two exhibitions that I'm curating right now. The exhibition with Jaishri Abichandani opens in 2022, January 2022 with the Craft Contemporary. And I really should have included work from that show in this lecture because there's a lot of witchcraft in that show in terms of how that artist is, I would say, deterring Hindu mythology, which is the tradition that she comes from as an Indian immigrant. But she's turning it into something that is extremely feminist and queer and overtly anti-patriarchal, and there's a lot of witchery involved. It's really powerful, but it's better if everybody just comes and sees that show in person when it's here in LA in the spring. So I'll also say that the exhibition that we're doing with the Getty support, which is at UCLA Art Sci Center, called Atmosphere of Sound, because of a couple of different reasons why I would say that that does tie in, even though there's no explicit reference, say, to metaphysics in that, is that on the one hand, we're talking about sound because it is an alternative to the sense of sight that Enlightenment thinking generally prioritizes, and most art that emerges from that Western intellectual tradition also privileges the sense of sight as an explicitly human sense that also in its scope provides a sort of right to dominion. This is extremely complicated, but I'm gonna pull it out a little bit more when I talk about specific works of art later on, I promise. So anyway, we're deprivileging sight and we're privileging sound, which is a way of also privileging non-human living beings, because often they engage with sound more than sight, or in a more complex way than sight. And then, of course, the subject is climate change. And I would argue that where witches really need to be active right now is in combating climate change, because it's not enough to argue for policy, to present data. None of these things are working, right? It's been decades now, and we've seen minimal policy change. So it's time for spellcasting, right? So I'm going to talk more about that too. I think political movements can be born out of witchcraft as well. And I would actually argue in some ways, in a really positive way, that movements like Black Lives Matter do emerge from that alternative, matriarchal, queer, African-American space, right? That space that is not governed by the values of the dominant culture. So with that, let me show you some art. So the first artist I want to talk about is my dear friend and mentor, the late Sonia Rapport. Give me 1 second because I have lost the panel on my Zoom screen. So I would like to see if I can see you all while I speak to you. Oh, there you are. Great. So Sonia was active, excuse me. Sonia was active from the late 1940s until 2015, when she passed in her mid-90s. She was first an abstract expressionist painter. She trained at Berkeley. She was one of the first women ever to earn her MFA at Berkeley in 1949, I believe was the year. And she studied with, in the Hans Hofmann abstract expressionist tradition, right? That she studied with people like Elmer Bischoff, who was a major Bay Area figuration painter. And that was the kind of work that she started out making. She's also the daughter of Russian immigrants. She's Jewish, and she raised a family. She raised 4 children in Berkeley. during her artistic career as well. So I found her to be, both a great font of wisdom and also just a wonderful person to be around. She was the first person to introduce me to the ideas of Silvia Federici and this concept that medieval knowledge, specifically in Europe, was carried by women and by minority communities, such as Jewish communities, Roma communities, that were present, but in some ways isolated from the dominant culture. And that those were the communities that treated the body medically, that often did a lot of the domestic work and care work, that had agricultural know-how, and that as the systems of financialization begin to take hold in the 16th and 17th centuries, in Western Europe we're talking about now, these kinds of knowledge become financially productive potentially, and they also become threatening to that new social order. And so what we see then is a pattern of persecution. So it's really important to remember, especially in European history, and this predates Europeans going in large numbers to the New World, that even before that action, there was this previous internal colonization action, right? Which is to financialize knowledge and restrict it to the hands of patriarchal authority, professionals. So doctors emerge, right? And this time, right, barbers were doctors in medieval times, and they would bleed you with leeches or with the razor. And it was really, obviously both gory and also maybe not very effective, right? And then there were other ways of treating the body. And that's what this work is about. So what Sonia's done is she's made this interactive piece where you can select an herb on the basis of a map of the human body. And it's a man. Here's the image. So what I want to say about her is that while she starts in this painting tradition, by the mid-1970s, she's an information artist. And by the mid-1980s, she's an internet artist. And she, was exhibiting with artists 40 years her junior who had come up in the age of the internet. And here's this woman, who was present essentially at its birth and made work about it. So she used to make these drawings that were photo transfer and colored pencil on tractor feed paper. And the paper came from the processing of information in Berkeley's organic chemistry, which is what her husband did and her daughter did, and then also anthropology, where she started to make connections with professors. When they were crunching data, when they would do archaeological digs, for example, in the American Southwest, and they would find pottery shards from communities that lived there 4,000 years ago, and then they would find other pottery shards in another community, and they would say, okay, are these from the same community? Are they an offshoot? Are they a completely other community? Are they from 4,000 years ago? Are they from 2,000 years ago? How do we know? And they would track all of the markings on the computer, and then the computer would analyze each sample against all of its catalog of markings, and it would come up with the classification. However, at that time, the computer did all of its thinking out loud. So it printed out every line to process, right? All of that compiling wasn't happening somewhere in silence in a server. It was happening in the printer. It was spitting out all of this data. And at the end, you would get what you needed. But everything else on the page was actually just what went into it. So, even there's a bit of witchcraft, because that computer coding, totally rational, totally mathematical, entirely fact-based, but really all that you need is the outcome. And the rest of it is frankly a mystery, right? So I think, what is it? Arthur C. Clarke said, any sufficiently sophisticated technology is indistinguishable from magic. I think there's a lot of that here, right? So for Sonia, this mystery of the new technology becomes her Kabbalah of a sort, right? So she's interested in her own traditions of Judaism and Jewish mysticism, and she's also interested in interfaith inquiries. So during her, in the 80s, she went to Iran, right? She had all of these different visits that she went on with her husband, who was, a respected professor and got invited to give these scientific lectures. So you could go to places, obviously, artists might not be invited to because you were there as the wife. And that's, of course, Frida Kahlo used to do this. So it's a perfectly legitimate place for a woman artist, by the way, or any artist, right? And it allows you to have this window on the world. That was something that she and I really related about, because my own grandmother, who was a little bit younger than Sonia, she's in her mid-90s now, also kind of experienced this. She had a high school education at best, but she traveled all around the world, lived all around the world, because she was married to an important doctor who was being invited to work with the UN and live in these different places. And so she had this incredible cosmopolitan viewpoint, which was amazing for a woman who was married at the age of 13. So this kind of knowledge isn't supposed to be available to women of this generation in this way. This truly worldly knowledge, this scope of knowledge. But of course it is. And so someone like Sonia was able to give that voice. And I think that's so powerful. So here's the Adam Kadmon. He's the figure who's lying prone in the four-poster bed here in the Brutal Myths installation, which was the installation at the exhibition that myself and Terry Cohn curated at Mills College Art Museum. It was part of a 2-part retrospective of 30 years of Sonia's work. You can see those scroll drawings that I'm talking about in the background here, these long tractor feed pages. So each of that is about 10 sections, and younger folks may not be so familiar with this, but essentially, the printer had these spokes on the side, and it would feed the paper with these holes that were in the paper, and then you were supposed to tear them off and tear them apart. But she loved it. She thought that it looked in a way like maybe, the support for like an old Chinese scroll or something. And she thought that she would work with it. So it's artifacts, right? It's working with debris. Have you ever heard like the kind of mythology that says, if you don't want to be hexed, you don't want to put somebody to put like a voodoo spell on you, you need to make sure that you don't put your fingernail clippings or your hair, right, into the trash can, because witches can take that and they can, do something to you. Right? Because we leave debris everywhere we go. This is part of the human condition, especially now when we're accumulating, right, disastrous amounts of plastic in the Great Pacific Gyre and disastrous amounts of information that is then leaked and spread all over the world. Human beings produce a lot of waste. And we have anxiety about that waste. And we blame it on witches. But it's not about the witches, it's about the fact that we know that our footprint is way too big. So what's really interesting to me about Sonia is that even in the 80s, she has this need to save things that are otherwise trash, right? And that's what archiving is. It's this compulsion to recognize in what other people consider to be discard, history being written. And to me, I think that's where my interest is going. My research interest is going. So you would get one of these packets, or as many as you wanted, and you would treat yourself or someone around you with whatever the herb was for whatever the symptom was that they would like to have cured. And each of those symptoms would be associated with some point on Adam's body. Now, of course, Adam is himself a Jewish icon, right? The first man. And Adam Kadmon in Sonia's mythology is the first man in the online universe. So he's Da Vinci, and he is, the original Adam, and he is information all at the same time. And so he has these different layers. He has a source hypertext layer, as you can see. He's got all of these different formulas, which are all the different herbs you can associate with him. There are stickers that you could place on him in the exhibition. As you took the herb to treat, you would symbolically treat the Adam, and then you would take the herb and theoretically, physically treat yourself or someone around you. So there's this connection between the world of information and physically acting on the body. And I think for me, that's kind of what my whole practice is about, is this, how do we combine the information realm and the realm of the body? And when we introduce the body into the realm of information, then is that in itself another of this kind of practice of witchcraft, right? Again, this comes back to the idea that sight or the intellect or the head is primary in the Western cosmos. And Adam here also exhibits that. However, when you lie him on his back, that's subverted. And suddenly the center chakra, right, which is the groin, becomes the focal point as opposed to the head or the feet. So even turning the body over changes the way that we understand everything about knowledge, about thought. So I'll say in passing too, I have this kind of thing about Namjoon Paik. I don't have him in the talk, but I did write about this once for Extra. Paik made a robot. It was supposed to be the first robot of the 21st century, and it's a great project. You should read about it. I'm not going to get into it now. But what I always thought was fascinating about Paik's robot is that it had two very biological elements. It had some kind of fatty latex protrusions in the chest area. So it had nipples or breasts of some kind, but not substantive, not enough to gender it explicitly one way or the other. And then it had a defecation system. It ingested and defecated beans as it rolled along. And so I thought, you know, when we talk about artificial intelligence, which is so much what I'm interested in, and in its own way, people respond to it as if it's a kind of witchcraft, even though at this point it's really just advanced data sorting techniques, right? So that this understanding in a way that the intellect could never truly be reproduced artificially in a way that would be viable or believable for humans as alive. It's extremely hard to do. But what can convince us that a being is alive instantly is if it defecates, because why else would it do that, right? And yet, in the Enlightenment, this idea is that, you know, the man, at first it's the Christian man, because it's the religious Enlightenment, and then later, as science takes over, then it's the rational man, but it's still imbued with a lot of the same philosophy, is cerebral. And the idea of bodily functions is rejected, right? They exist, but they're a necessary evil, as opposed to something that should be celebrated or contemplated or valued. And so that in itself is a kind of non-Western approach. And so that's a good place for me to introduce this other idea, which is about morals versus ethics, which is something I've been thinking about a lot, because I often find myself out of sync living in the United States, even with other people of color. And I wonder why that is. And then a friend of mine said recently, you know, I was raised as a Taoist. When people assert Christian morality in a situation, it doesn't have any meaning for me. And I said, oh my God, that explains it. You know, I was raised as a Hindu. I don't believe in Hinduism now, nor do I associate with it because it has a rather terrible racist element. However, I do think that the metaphysics of that frame of knowledge are extremely important to me. So this is again where I identify with witchcraft, because I won't identify with official religion, but I'll take those aspects that I can liberate from a patriarchal and oppressive and violent frame, and I'll use them like I will anything else, right? But that also makes me suspect in the sense that I am not culturally authentic in my practice of my belief system either. You know, it's not to say that those beliefs are not shared by other people in my community. They certainly are, particularly by feminists in my community. But we're not traditional in that sense. We're not viewed as traditional. Our views, our beliefs are never viewed as part of the tradition. That's, again, why the association or the affinity with witchcraft as an idea, right? So if the moral is associated with how one should behave, which is functionally around norms and rules, right? Then the ethical is about how one should behave, which is functionally about how are you going to feel about it later, how are other people going to feel about it, right? And so when the feeling of this feels right, people are going to feel good about it, and the expectation of that's not normal, we have rules about this, collide. This seems to be my sweet spot, apparently. But that, I think, is where the work needs to be done, right? So this is an ongoing philosophical question I'm kind of wrestling with, but I think that it dovetails with this conversation about witches. So one more point from Sonia before we move on is that there's also this kind of idea in the idea of witchcraft that comes from actually the Jungian mode of the collective unconscious. So today we don't talk about that so much, partly because this idea of universal culture is very much a liberal idea, and it tends to, in some ways, erase or flatten or make non-specific elements of different cultural beliefs and practices and push them into what is now a subliminally Judeo-Christian framework. So there are challenges to the Jungian notion of, or the what we'd say, what's his name? The Joseph Campbell notion, right? Of one world myth, collective unconscious, collective belief. But that said, there's definitely what you might refer to today as collective affect, right? So what that means, right, is, so for example, Arjun Appadurai writes about this, how crowd mentality functions. That could be anything from crowdfunding, oh, let's get on board and be competitive and help this organization, and it can be a very benevolent thing, or it can be like the Capitol riot, right, where a mob gets riled up and the crowd carries everybody, and then the defense that all those people are mounting and the senators in the United States who don't want to confront this reality is that, oh, well, they were swept up in the crowd. None of these people are individually responsible. Trump himself is not responsible. None of the people who broke windows, people who brought weapons into the Capitol, none of them are responsible. It was the crowd, right? The crowd is its own actor in that sense. So I think what Sonia caught onto all the way back in 1987, and this is a version she showed in 2011, where she brought recent press clippings from the New York Times. Here you see Nicolas Sarkozy, who was in 2011 the president of France, and Angela Merkel, who was then the chancellor of Germany, trying to reconcile their positions on the Greek debt crisis, where they were actually quite far apart at the time, right? Now, finance itself is a kind of witchcraft, because the Greek debt crisis itself was in some ways manufactured by French, German, and British banking interests, right, who all sold a lot of cheap debt to Greece and then cashed in at the same time, and their economy bottomed out. And then everything was cheap in Greece, and all those rich Germans and French and British people came and bought country houses. And now they go in the summer and they hang out on the beach, right? So there's this, it is all witchcraft in a sense, because, and finance especially we talk about crypto, which I'm not really going to get into now, but I might get into it at the end. Something that I've become kind of interested in and started to talk about with respect to NFTs and artist participation. But when you look at the crypto market, you absolutely see witchcraft, right? Why would people buy Dogecoin? And then because Elon Musk said something on Twitter, all sell Dogecoin, right? There's no financial rationality in that. It's the logic of the crowd. So with that, Sonia points out that we don't always know that we're speaking on behalf of a larger voice. So here we see how Sarkozy, in his assurances to the public, to the press, to Merkel herself, adopts a mudra. He adopts a gesture that predates him, predates his moment. He has no conscious knowledge of this gesture, which comes from the lexicon of Buddhist sculpture, probably from the 10th or 12th century that this language is developed, right? Maybe earlier. But he's doing it anyway, because we all know what that means. And so the digital mudra is about that. It's about looking at each of us, the public, the celebrities and leaders and all of that, but also each of us, as we present, how do you feel? And she'll ask you. And so the other part of this was you would stand in front of a camera and she would say, ask the computer how you feel. And the computer would tell you how you feel. It would give you a mudra, and then you would perform the mudra. So this, again, predates social media. And it was funny at the time, like, why are you asking the computer how you feel? Don't you know how you feel? But people really liked it. In 1987, they said, yes, computer, tell me how to feel. Right? And remember, 1987 was a difficult time. It was the Reagan era, it was the AIDS crisis. Like, maybe people really didn't know how to feel. So we do turn to technology to give us insights about ourselves. Is that a kind of witchcraft? Why does the computer know things that we don't know about us? And I think even digital bias, information bias, is doing exactly that. Information that it presents to us shows us who we really are in a way that we maybe prefer would not to know, right? So with that, I think there's so much mystery in the world we live in now, even though it's all governed by rational data. There's so much mystery. Where does the body belong? Where's the spirit in all of this? Where is love? Where is connection? Where is belief? Right? In a world that's governed by bits and capital, all of that is magic. So we're all witches in that sense, right? And everything we do outside of the churn of go to work, produce desire, then consume, then rest, then repeat, right? If we're not just doing those things, if we're not just perpetuating this labor and consumption cycle, then we're breaking that chain, then we're performing witchcraft, in a sense. So I'm moving very slowly, and I should probably speed up a little bit because I've gotten through like 4 slides out of 20. That's okay, I can be quick. But I did want to take a moment to acknowledge this particular mythology. So this is the work of Elena Bajo, who's a Spanish artist, and I think her work is really interesting because she takes the position of wanting to understand, okay, so if I'm a Spanish person and I come to California, I'm not just one Spanish person who comes to California, I'm one of many Spanish people who've come to California. And what were we doing here? Right? And of course what they were doing was establishing the missions. So she started to learn about the establishment of the missions and the cultures that were here when the missions arrived. So it was through this project, which was right after I moved to LA, that I learned about Toypurina. I'm going to read you a little bit of my own writing about Toypurina. So Toypurina is a 9-year-old Tongva Gabrieleño girl living by the beach in Santa Monica when Gaspar de Bartola describes the tar pits to Europeans for the first time. She is 25 and a shaman when she leads the attack to overthrow the Padre Junipero Serra at the San Gabriel mission in 1785. Death comes at 39, not for the martyr, but for the Madre, a Christian soldier's wife, the mother of mestizo children. Toypurina's sentence is to the prison of the home. 255 years have passed since her birth. Her ancestors' final resting place is a soccer field nestled within a thicket of condominiums in Playa Vista. So everything comes up in this project. It's about gentrification, it's about erasure, it's about religious conversion, it's about forced marriage, it's about the birth of blended people, right? In that time, the version of conversion that the Spanish were practicing was to Europeanize through procreation and to Catholicize the indigenous people and to, in that sense, integrate them and integrate all of their assets as well. So this continues, right? This practice of integration of, okay, well, we'll give you a voice, we'll give you a space, we'll give you a community, but we will continually encroach, right? Why does that soccer pitch need to be built in exactly the spot where there have been remains of indigenous people buried for 400 years? Why can't it move 300 feet? Especially when there's a community outcry, and yet it just couldn't happen, right? And that was in a moment now, I think almost 15 years ago, when the whole west side of Los Angeles was not yet completely unaffordable, but it is now. When the waterfront was not yet completely owned by international investors who spent maybe 30 out of every 365 days at the property. And a lot of times they're just dark and vacant when you walk along the beachfront, right? Which is how it is now. So these doors that are opened, this message that the Venice City Council or the Los Angeles City Council sends that says, no, we don't need that memory. You can bulldoze it. You can move it to this other more convenient place, right? That opens the door for all the memories that we don't need, right? To be pushed out, to be wiped away. And this is consistently what's been happening. It was beginning in this moment, and it was a big part of the work that I was doing when I was working on the West Side. And ultimately it was a wave that I couldn't fight anymore. And it was part of what pushed me out. So this has been a theme all the way through, right? So these dancers, these performers activate the space and they reflect on the condition of the soil. She used the soil from the Playa Vista development, the park that was designated as the sort of concession, and she mixed it into ceramics, and she made the ceramics into an element of the installation, and then the land spoke on behalf of the people in this way. So there's this conjuring that takes place. So Elena and I talked a lot about Federici when we were doing this project. And then Candice Lin and I talked a lot about Federici when we were doing this project, because she wanted to anchor it in this idea of Cigaraxs. So Cigaraxs Garden, right, is a place that doesn't exist. Cigaraxs is a character in Shakespeare's Tempest. She is never seen. She is the mother of Caliban. Caliban is a slave, and he's a debased man. He's a rapist. He's not in control of his urges. He is essentially a kind of useful savage in Shakespeare's cosmos, who provides both a philosophical and a plot-based foil to Prospero, the wise and noble European king, who's washed up on the shore of this island somewhere in the mythical Caribbean, right? The Tempest is very interesting because it is written less than 100 years after First Contact. And it's one of those examples, like Dürer's Rhinoceros, of great European art in the image of an other that has actually not been observed. I've only heard about this. I've heard about the Caribbean. I've heard that it exists. I've heard about North Africa. I've heard that it exists. I've heard about rhinoceri, but I don't know what they are. Here's what I imagine. And honestly, it's these kinds of pictures that form the image of the rest of the world for Europeans. By the time the average European person can travel to the Caribbean, the Tempest is already well entrenched, right? And so even though it's fiction, it becomes a mythology. It becomes the Europeans' version of where they're going and what they're there to do. And that fills the need to justify what's happening. So Cigaraxs Garden is a botanical project fundamentally. Candice is very interested in plants that have hormonal properties, that affect the body, that affect gender. And she also collaborated with Patrick Staff, and they worked together on certain synthetic testosterones that come from plants. So this is an ongoing kind of, again, organic chemistry project. And it's also a discursive space where people can learn about the history of colonization and characters in that history who are very interesting. For example, Jeanne Barret, who was a navigator on ships that traveled to the New World, collected, I think she was on one of the ships that Darwin was on, and she was posing as a man the entire time and was only discovered well into the journey. And she was able to make a lot of discoveries and to advance significantly in this space as a white woman who gained professionally by colonization, right? So she's a conflicted character if we look at her from a 21st century perspective. The conflicted characters are the most interesting. So Candice will talk about this. She'll talk about how these different spices or herbs that we're working with to make incense are coming from these specific stops, and that, you know, the boats that traveled picked up plants, but also animals, but also human beings, right? And that all of this idea of trade, right, it comes back to the shipping of commodities, living commodities, into and out of Europe. So these are hard things to talk about. And sometimes when you just start talking about them, especially in a community like Santa Monica, where there's already a lot of sensitivity about some of the issues that I just discussed, people knowing that they have a role in displacement, people feeling anxious about not knowing how to approach their neighbors, who are often Indigenous people, right? If not from the community locally, although there are many of those people, then perhaps from other parts of North America that still have that history, have that knowledge. So when you're doing something with your hands, it's so much easier to have this conversation. You're doing something with your body. So it can be a workshop, it could be a yoga class, it can be a dance movement experience, but it just frees up the mind to open to new ideas. And I think that's something I've noticed in the programming you've been doing, that there's a lot of getting physical and participating, and I think that's really important. It's part of what, again, residency is about. It's not just about putting work up on a wall and calling it an exhibition, although as you'll see, some of the works did get more developed in that way. As I was able to expand the time frame and the budgets for the residencies, we were able to develop more fully completed exhibitions as a result. But all the way through, process and discussion has always been paramount. That's the goal. So I'm not going to show you this video now, unfortunately, because I am talking way too slowly and we don't have 5 minutes to spare. So I'm just going to put the link in the chat. It's a very interesting film. Maybe I'll show it at the end if I manage to speed it up. And let me just do that. Hold on 1 second. Hopefully you can watch it later. Where did the chat go? I can't do that. Stephen, you have it from before. Would you just drop it in again?
Sure.
Thank you. Cool. Sorry, I can't always see my controls when I'm screen sharing. So this is a work we developed with Vishal Jugdeo, who's my colleague at UCLA. I should mention, after doing these projects with Candice and Vishal, both of them were hired as full-time professors at UCLA in the Department of Art, and they subsequently brought me in to decolonize the art history curriculum. So that's what I do now. So that was a kind of an ongoing relationship beginning, in 2014 when I first approached them to do the work, culminating with the exhibitions in 15 and 16. Both of the artists have gone on to reiterate ideas and concepts and partnerships from those original residencies with me into subsequent years of work. So that's the other thing about residencies, is when you tell an artist everything you've already done and planned that's dedicated to someone and something else, like, let's look beyond that. What do you want to do afterward? And they start to work toward that. They come into all of these ideas. So in Candice's case, it was organic chemistry and botanicals and distilling and all these practices that she uses today. With Vishal, it was this relationship with Vikramaditya Sahai, who's a poet in New Delhi. So we were going to do a project. Vishal was really at a peak moment in his career. He had just received a Guggenheim Fellowship. I think he was in his early 30s. He was in Made in LA. He was in the Whitney Biennial. He was blowing up. And he had a crisis. He didn't want to make objects anymore at all. And he didn't want to make stories. He didn't want to do storytelling and narrative and fiction, which is a huge part of the LA film scene and a lot of how he was trained. Right? Here in LA, we make fictions. That's our industry. And all those people are available to artists. It's actually a great asset, because sometimes if a project is interesting, you can hire someone who works on major Hollywood productions to help you create the illusion. And if they're interested in doing it, they'll do it for scale and you can afford them. So artists often take advantage of this here, and Vishal is certainly not a stranger to that. But he reached a point where it wasn't that wasn't the story he wanted to tell. He wanted to know what was true. But he didn't necessarily trust filmmaking as a medium to tell us what's true. So it was a crisis. And he went to India. He thought maybe he was leaving art altogether. But of course he had a deadline that I was sort of like holding over him in the background. And he went and he was connected with Vikram, I think through Alok Vedmanan, who is an important figure in the United States and I think in North America in general around non-binary and assigned male at birth identity. So Vikram has, again, a complex gender identity, uses he, him pronouns, presents extremely feminine. And this is a very Western intellectual gender position, and one that he will readily acknowledge. He looks very much like my mother did when she was in medical school in the 1960s with the white sari and the long hair. So he doesn't look like an Indian Delhi girl today, right? He looks like his mother looked when she was 20, and that's the image of femininity that he wants to embrace. And that timelessness, in a way, is part of his persona. As I said, he's a poet, and he's a radical activist who has been involved in protests against the government. The Indian government is becoming more and more and more oppressive in a number of ways against religious minorities, ethnic minorities, and anyone who dissents. And so that's chronicled in the work that's in the clip, or rather the clip is the beginning of a work called Does Your House Have Lions, which followed on this work called Vikram, which we made. So Vishal has continued to work with Vikram, and Vikram self-represents, and so it's very interesting from the perspective of like even things that are emerging in the discipline of anthropology itself, right? Which are around self-study, that everyone is able to communicate their own experience, right? So Spivak would call this allowing the subaltern to speak. Juan Downey, in his wonderful film called The Laughing Alligator from the 1970s, does this thing where he goes down to Brazil to meet the Yanomami, who at the time were both being sort of celebrated in Western media as the last uncontacted community of the Amazon, and like seriously being inundated with anthropologists and filmmakers and artists and all these people who wanted to get a piece of their authenticity, right? And they were very savvy. Despite being uncontacted, they knew exactly how to do it, right? Which showed that they were a leader in the community that had existed around them previous to those other communities' extermination. They're becoming the last. They knew how to negotiate their position. And so Downey, who was Chilean but based in New York, recognized this. And he gave the camera to the Yanomami people in The Laughing Alligator. And it's about how they begin by shooting arrows at him or threatening to, and basically letting him know that he's only there as their guest again, you know, and then he gives them the camera and then they start to document him. And so then it's a more, and much of Downey's work, even with non-human species like with bees, also uses this idea that the camera will allow the subject to self-identify, self-express, self-understand, right? So this comes back to the idea at the beginning, self-representation is what witchcraft is really all about. So Vishal has arrived at this technique of what I would call speculative documentary, where he invites his subjects to become the filmmakers, his collaborators, and also to study him, who's an awkward figure, right? He is a Canadian-raised, Guyanese Indian person based in the United States. So his parents came from Guyana. He was born in Canada. And, you know, you can even see it. Like, it's obvious in my whole generation of Indian Americans. We go to India, we're like a solid foot taller than everybody else. Like there's a shot of Vikram and his roommate, and then Vishal like in the kitchen, and Vishal's enormous, right? Like we're different. We seem different. So there's that part where if it was a conventional documentary, Vishal would be behind the camera and we wouldn't see that, like how his actual physique in itself is a marker of the kind of privilege that those of us have in the diaspora. Right? That's something that only other people can report back to us. And so often in the art world, we are being asked, this is something that South Asian artists and curators like myself and Vishal deal with all the time. We are asked and expected to ethnographize our community. It's framed as a kind of self-reporting, but it isn't self-reporting, because if I were to go to India and tell you a story about Indians, I would not be self-reporting. I would be reporting on somebody else. So I think that's the part that gets really, really fuzzy in the art world. It's what causes crisis. And in this work, I feel like it was a really interesting way to go about it. So the most recent work, which again, you'll watch a short clip of hopefully, and it will look much better if you do it yourself than if I stream it anyway, deals with the other question, the really important question, which is about caste, which is something that all of us who are South Asians are having to negotiate, caste and religious identity, and how oppressive historically and now that continues to be, not only in India, but actually here in the United States as well. And so this film really takes up this question of how does caste intersect with queerness, and how does, again, this Western framing of queer culture, gender identity, which is quite different from the way that historically and traditionally gender nonconformity has been expressed in India, right? That this represents an intellectual sphere. These people are PhD students, but at the same time, they're speaking from a space of marginalization, right? And not even Vikram necessarily, but there's other characters and figures in the film. They're not really characters, right? They're real people who are representing their perspectives that are even, you know, speaking from a more marginalized perspective than his. So this is an ongoing project, and the sphere expands to be more inclusive as Vishal develops this work and develops the network and the level of trust. So again, as you can see in this image, the camera's always kind of around. If the subject themselves is not holding the camera, then the camera maker, the camera holder rather, the filmmaker, or the director being Vishal and the cinematographer will be in the frame. right? So that you always have the sense of it's the box with the sound of its own making, the film with the image of its own construction, so that you always understand that it was made, right? So the magic of filmmaking is completely collapsed here. It's an exposure, but there is a poetic magic that takes place. So I'm going to just move quickly now. This is Kenyatta Hinkle. Her work very directly engages with ideas of shamanism. This is a costume that she will put on to perform a ritual as a character from her universe that she calls Kentifrica, which is a fusing of American Southern and West African ancestry, right, that she shares as an American-born Black person from Louisville, Kentucky. So it's a really interesting project. It's also organized around food. She does tarot readings. So here she's doing a tarot reading. There's a reading section. There's objects that she makes that are Kentifrican artifacts. So it plays with this whole idea of archive, right? What kind of archive exists of a place that doesn't exist? But the place does exist because it's a conceptual space that actually exists in each of our minds as a culturally hybrid person. So it's activating that knowledge and having people locate themselves in the idea of Kentifrica and locate Kentifrica in them is what makes the project. She's a wonderful artist. She's at Berkeley now. I was there once in the past, and then she went there, and I'm happy because it keeps that kind of connection going, right? I will say I think I did a little bit of witchcraft at Berkeley. It involved James Luna, the great late Native American artist, who did a ritual while I was there. And we also had long conversations about Ishi, the last Yahi Indian, California Indian tribe, who actually lived at the Hearst Museum of Anthropology for many years. The Hearst Museum was not then located in Kroeber Hall being named for the anthropologist who actually brought Ishi to the museum. And the other thing people often don't realize is that the Kroebers were the parents of Ursula K. Kroeber Le Guin. So her whole earthsea, ecological kind of framework of, a speculative future, a feminist-led future, emerges from this same white anthropological tradition. So it's really interesting, and she's somewhat aware of it, right? So it's fascinating to think about these incredible connections. And we had these conversations, and then James went on to actually do a project about Ishi. So there's this way in which just having conversations with people, sharing knowledge. I'd been talking with Ben Garcia at the time, who was the curator at the Hearst Museum, about what was in their collection, which included Indigenous peoples' remains that remain in the Berkeley Study collections. I had connected with a really close friend of mine, Mark Ankew, who at the time was working with the American Indian Movement and Treaty Council, and they were protesting Berkeley because of the presence of those indigenous remains that they wanted repatriated. But of course, that process is incredibly complicated because it requires federal recognition, which a lot of tribes don't have. It requires resources for lawyers, and a lot of tribes don't have it. And it requires, some way to intern those bodies and to treat those relics, and a lot of tribes don't have it. So it becomes very difficult to reclaim that heritage. So all of this was in the mix. This was the conversation that we were having. And this is why I say we did a little bit of witchcraft, because a lot of that led to a much greater presence of artists of color, Indigenous artists in the department, as students and as faculty being represented in those conversations. Ben did a lot of great work at the Museum of Anthropology at Berkeley. Then he went to the Museum of Man in San Diego, created the first decolonization position, like official decolonization position in the United States at the Museum of Man, which is, of course, where James Luna did his first famous piece, the artifact piece. So there's this kind of loop of actually making change, that the change is first articulated by the vision of the artist, and then, people pick that up, and that person's legacy and the people that they touch, and that it actually does expand, and it really does manifest. So even though it often feels like things aren't changing, I think, having been witness to that now over a decade, I can say, yeah, stuff does actually change. So it works. We just got to keep doing it. So Sherin Guirguis did this wonderful work we're coming up on an hour, so I'm going to wrap. I'm just going to come to the end, about Daria Shafiq. So a lot of this is about knowing who your forebears are. Daria Shafiq was an active feminist in Egypt from the 1920s to the 1960s. She was very vocal against the regime, multiple regimes, and their treatment of women and their marginalization politically and intellectually of women. She was a PhD in philosophy from the Sorbonne. She was an absolute genius. And I didn't know anything about her until I worked with Sherin. Sherin only learned about her because she had been working on a predecessor to Daria Shafiq, Huda Sharawi, who was much better known in Egypt and outside. And through learning about Huda Sharawi, she learned about Daria Shafiq, who was a middle-class person, as opposed to Sharawi, who was an upper-class person, and who was still able to build a political movement around herself. And of course, you can see, look how fabulous she was, right? So historical witches, right? Women who bend space and time. And so Sherin makes these abstract compositions, paintings, sculptures, installations. She's using Adobe here. That's a kind of technologically developed building material that leaves no trace and can be collapsed. It's also part of the project. And it's all kind of exploring forms that she would then use in her later exhibition at Craft Contemporary that was also entirely organized around Shafiq and her ideas. And then she took that to Egypt and started a conversation with an exhibition in Egypt that was the first conversation in public about Daria Shafiq in decades, that she was able to do because she's America-based, right? Because she's Egyptian, she's from there, but she lives here and her support is here, so there's very little repercussion for her. And she can then create a space where it's possible for other women to have access to this knowledge. And that's what all of this is about. That's what the reading and conversation pit is about. That's what the gatherings that we have in the space are about. And ultimately, there's an alchemy taking place as well. Here you see she's using earth and gold leaf, and these materials in combination are meant to do something metaphysical as well, right? So I'm just going to take a moment to talk about psychomagic. So this project by Carmen Argote about learning to ride a motorcycle and tracing those paths in the gallery at 18th Street really draws on this idea of psychomagic, which comes from Roski. So Roski had this idea that you would manifest what you want in reality by symbolically representing it and manifesting it in the symbolic realm first. This drives a lot of Guillermo Gómez-Peña's work, and it drove Carmen's work in the sense that she wanted to create an emotional resolution between herself and her father around this motorcycle, which was an object that was a kind of talismanic object for her. And so tracing these paths in a performance that we did in Griffith Park with 9 participants, and also then in the gallery at 18th Street where she recreated visually elements of the performance. As you can see, it was like a happenings kind of thing where it was based on a score, and each act would unfold with a plan, but not according necessarily to plan. So then we had the video of the performance playing, we had these images, and ultimately she did manifest a reconciliation in the relationship. It wasn't the healing reconciliation that she sought. It was a rupture where she decided she wasn't going to have anything to do with her father anymore. However, the most important part was that she manifested herself, right? And so through this practice of the psychomagic, of the ritual action, she came to know herself more fully, and she didn't need that external validation anymore. So I thought it was a really beautiful project. In conclusion, the artists that I'm working with are trying to resurrect the missing archive. So in Clarissa Towson's case, those are ocarinas from Guatemala that are Mayan, that have been unearthed in digs, and they are not accessible to Mayan descended people, of which there are many in the LA area. So Clarissa partnered with an academic, Jared Katz, who was 3D scanning and printing these objects, and she's been refining the technique. These are done 3D printed with a plastic-based slurry, but she's learned that working with a ceramic-based slurry provides a cleaner sound for the instrument. The idea is to actually create very close replicas of these authentic archaeological objects from the 16th and 17th centuries that are too fragile to play, and put them in the hands of Mayan descended musicians and musicologists that allow them to understand how to play these. And it's quite wonderful if you meet somebody who actually does know how to play it. There was one woman who came in to the gallery who actually knew how to play one of these, and she picked it up and she made the most amazing sounds. So I have a video of that somewhere, but I don't have it for you today. So this is the idea, is we're reintroducing into the archive. I should note with Clarissa too that there's a response to another fabricated archive, which is the Mayan revival houses of Frank Lloyd Wright, of which there are several here in Los Angeles, some of which form the backdrop of American science fiction. The most famous is the Ellis House, which was in Blade Runner. It's where Deckard and Rachel have a number of scenes in that house. You'll notice these blocks that have these pattern formations in them, right? It was used in Game of Thrones. It's been used in all of these shows. It was owned by Ron Burkle, the industrialist and friend of Bill Clinton, who did this huge restoration on it for millions of dollars. So it's also become this kind of emblem of Hollywood power and political power and wealth as well. So that house in particular kind of, again, uses this Mayan revival aesthetic, but ultimately its ownership, its provenance, all tell a story of financial colonization and the colonization of the mind and the imagination, right? So, and how the Mayan revival, which is not actually based on authentic Mayan patterns at all, comes to stand in not only for the ancient timeless of the Mayan, but for Asian cultures, for, it could be anything basically in Hollywood, for medieval Europe, right? So there's this kind of hodgepodge aspect of the culture that she wants to speak back to with some kind of specificity. So performance becomes a huge part of that, right? Marcus Colanesario here countering toxic masculinity with a ritualistic performance where men learn from one another and care for one another. Also this installation, which involved interviews with men about their fathers. It's a really powerful project where he was trying to, again, exercise. Sometimes artists are dealing with their own issues, right? Carmen and Marcus both had very traditional macho Mexican fathers. Well, I'm sorry, forgive me. Marcus's father was Puerto Rican. Macho Latinx fathers, right? He grew up in LA in a very Mexican community, but he's Puerto Rican. And their fathers were unreliable, and their fathers kind of modeled this toxic version of care. And so Carmen, in this kind of gender fluid way, where she's really kind of adopting the position of the firstborn son, although she's a daughter, and Marcus in this caregiving way, where he actually identifies more with the mother and the matriarch, but tries to literally kind of reweave the family fabric. So I think that's really interesting in terms of how care and gender are very aligned, and how self-realization and self-care and the assembling of a community, both of these projects, Carmen's and Marcus's, both gathered people who were meaningful and close to the artist to be participants. It wasn't just whoever we could hire, right? Those relationships of care, ritualized in performance art, were personally meaningful to the artist. They did it for themselves and for the culture. And that's really important to me. So I'm going to just conclude now quickly with a little bit of what I wrote for Guillermo Gómez-Peña and La Pocha Nostra's book, A Handbook for the Rebel Artist in a Post-Democratic Society, which is this right here. And it was the letter to a radical mom, where I really kind of reconciled myself to my reality, right, as a working parent. And I'm just going to say here, in cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco, where we live, it can seem like the public does not desire the presence of children. As mothers, we're supposed to apologize for ourselves on airplanes, in restaurants, anywhere we might offend the childless, for whom our offspring are but an inconsiderate extension of ourselves into their rightful space. Womb spreading. What could be more narcissistic than birthing a child? What could be more generous? And this is something I've struggled with a lot, right? This idea that when we have people around us who are dependent on us and we care for them, that we're somehow not doing our job. We're not being productive. That work isn't valuable, and it doesn't need to be made space for, right? And Federici comes out against this. And Gómez-Peña, right, is a radical machismo in a sense, right? He's so, in some ways, he's often responded to by audiences as a hyper-masculine archetype, and yet he's incredibly gentle and caregiving, and that's his practice. That's the radical pedagogy. So that's what I'm learning from every day, and having the opportunity to work with artists like him and Luna, where this idea of indigenous knowledge, right? So something that came up when Stephen and I were checking in previously, which of course has been huge news in the States as well, is the discovery of the 215 children's bodies at the residential school. And I've been thinking about this a lot because, of course, there were residential schools in the United States too, and there were similar abuses. But the conversation doesn't really even exist here about this having happened here, right? And Gómez-Peña and Luna come from a generation of people who experienced the aftermath of that. If they themselves did not experience re-education, then certainly they encountered elders who had, right? Luna was a social worker. His whole career as a famous, internationally recognized artist, he was going to work at the community college on the reservation outside of San Diego, being a social worker to young indigenous people and trying to keep them from a life of alcoholism, which is ultimately what took him, right? He was both of these people at the same time. And so that care, you've got to bring that care back. And that's something I really respect about these artists. This is Sandy Rodriguez making work about the border, talking about the children who died in incarceration here in the United States at the US-Mexico border, using earth to make her pigments, and making a prayer. There's actually a poem in the catalog. I wrote an essay for the catalog, and there is a writer who wrote poems for each of the 9 children, and they're actually invocations, right? So again, there's this kind of spell casting. She's using those botanicals. Thinking back to Carmen, she's getting pigments from the land, and she's drawing these quetzal birds that symbolize resurrection for the children who died. So again, there's this kind of way of acknowledging it's political, but it's also spell casting. She had images of these deities in the work as well as these narratives of her time at the border. And so this kind of work, right, this mutual aid, this care, this border crossing, this is a community here in LA, the Auntie Sewing Squad, anchored in LA, but based all over the country, mostly women of color, and non-binary individuals as well, who have been conducting relief efforts during the quarantine for indigenous communities, the Navajo Nation, the Lakota Sioux, and they've been bringing these materials all over the country, and they've been sewing masks for frontline workers, and it's all volunteer, right? So mutual aid. In the end, witchcraft is mutual aid. It's aunties. It's women-led groups who organize, who socialize beyond child raising, who constitute that village, right? Not the corporate village of Hillary Clinton, but the real mutual aid care village. And so finally, this one's less about mythology perhaps, or less about witchcraft and more about mythology, but I still think it fits. This is a billboard that we did with Stop Discrimination, which is a group that I work with. And we're self-organized art workers of Asian American background who are speaking up after a year or more of really racist rhetoric, racist attacks. And it's been challenging because some people in the group only recently realized that they might be targeted, and only really recently realized that they were viewed as different. And other people have had to reconcile that much earlier because of other historical events that have taken place, like 9/11, for example, which didn't affect all Asian people the same. So working with the artist Kenneth Tam and his really wonderful work called Silent Spikes, which is about Chinese immigrants working on the railroad in the 19th century, in the development of the American West, and the kind of masculinity mythology of the cowboy. We took some images from his work. We added this slogan, Asians have been here longer than cowboys. And I'm going to read you just this little text that we wrote, mostly authored by Astrid Siparek with edits from the rest of us. Long before immigrants sought fortune during the gold rush, Asians have been on the land we now call the United States. It was 1587 when sailors from Manila landed on Chumash land in the California coast. By the 1700s, migrants from India had arrived, and Filipinos established permanent settlements in present-day Louisiana. It wasn't until 1849 that the cowboy, which is based on Mexican vaquero traditions, came to be associated with the American West. So that's how we came to this slogan, and ultimately, I just want to close there and say that, you know, what we're trying to do again is actually cast a kind of spell. In this case, it was also Pride Month, and we were well aware of that. And we really liked the way in which this image charged the atmosphere with a counter narrative, right? It's those spells, it's those counter narratives. It's by speaking that we make it true, by symbolizing it that we make it true. And so that's where I'm going to wrap. Thanks for letting me go long, and thank you so much for listening today.
Thank you so much, Anuradha. It was awesome. It was amazing just to think about the through line, the commonalities, the sort of calling of each individual artwork and artist, where it's more than a kind of privately defined notion of excellence, right? I think the witch as a figure and also as a model is really, it's amazing. I didn't realize all the connections. One question I have, and this is uh, a question in formation, I'm not sure if it's totally clear, is there a connection between casting spells and strike? You know, I'm wondering if that's also a uh, we're at a moment where there's so much, and I also really love the how witchcraft may also be a mechanism or a process to sort of understand how what collective feeling is, right? So I'm wondering if there is, casting a spell is not just a productivist notion. It's not just like, oh, I need gold, right? Or I need to be healed, right? To a certain degree it is, but it's also an exit. So I'm wondering if there is a correlation between a strike and a spell.
Sure. Well, I mean, okay, let's take it back to Toy Purina. She was a shaman, which in her community meant that she was a healer. And she also led the attack on the San Gabriel mission because she was a leader. And she was only 15, right? So I do think, I mean, we have figures like that in Western mythology, like Joan of Arc as well. There is this idea that sometimes a spell and a strike are the same, right? Because both are actions against some kind of repression or oppressive power. But then I also think about how much we need to rally affect right now in order to get people to stand up for their rights. You know, I mean, also, like, I'm a part-timer at the universities that I teach at. One of my unions is probably going to go on strike next year. And the great challenge there is that we have tried to invoke our power against the university to get living working conditions that are tolerable for a long time, and they simply use their superior might to be obstructionist. And people don't want to threaten their livelihood. They're overworked, they're overtaxed, they're extra drained now after quarantine. They don't want to run afoul of anybody that they're working closely with. And yet, you know, we have to invoke somehow collective will to stand up against the university, or they're just going to run us over. The university is assuming that we won't get the numbers because we won't have the stamina because they have already broken us enough, right? And I mean, we can't allow that, but it could happen. So I think there's a spell casting that even needs to happen there. And I think actually, you know, the way that labor organizers operate is often not very much in sync with the sorts of spells they need to be casting, right? So I go to a union meeting for the part-time faculty union, and they're like singing work songs from the 20s, and I'm like, none of us can relate to this. You know, this isn't an environment that makes sense to a lot of us. It's not going to bring the new grad students necessarily, you know, and so there's this kind of thing too, like, what kind of spells are you casting? Who are you casting them with, right? And this also happens a lot in diversity work, where once you become someone who is recognized as speaking out about the problems that exist, then that becomes your other job. And sometimes it's not your even compensated job. Or it becomes the thing people want you to do instead of the research that you do and the work that you do. And it eats up all your time, you know. And what you really need to be doing is spell casting so that the organization will do the work themselves, right? Whereas what they want you to do is to be present and do the work for them. I don't know. I have a lot to say about that, but maybe I'll stop there. You know?
Thank you. Any other questions from the group? There's a lovely thank you note in the chat. Yeah. Excellent. Okay. I mean, I think, thank you so much. It was amazing.
I have a question that I want to ask, you know,
Yes,
and
please.
I'll ask the people here, and I'll also ask people who are watching this after the fact, which is, you know, what do we need now? I mean, I was reading this wonderful article about the possibility of a youth movement this summer, another summer of love, you know, and obviously it's something that, like, my students need that, right? I mean, I think we all need that, like, contact, care, collectivism, getting out on the street together. So what kind of spells can we cast together to get that popular movement, that living together and being together happening again, right? So that's, I guess, my question for you all. Not that I need an answer, but think about it, right? What can you do to invoke the kind of community that you want to have and be in around you now, and make that change that you want to see?
I mean, one thing I think one thing I personally have been thinking about is thinking about exits of cycles, right? Like, the frequency of crises are in a span of a month, so maybe having deep historical consciousness, but also a type of consciousness that is not um, strictly kind of Western, I think is important, like deep knowledge as a sense of immunity. I mean, I think that's perhaps an egghead answer, but one thing I've been thinking about.
I'd add to that, and thank you so much, Anuradha. That was just a wonderful presentation, and thanks, Steve, for organizing this. I'm thinking of the notion of relationality and familial relationships in the sense that many of us are coming from spaces of extended family and connecting to that family as in different ways. But if we can extend that, be able to connect with our communities that way, which is outside the logic of a Western industrial state, right? Where you have the nuclear family and you have a relationship to the institution in some ways, right? I mean, if you look at us, at our various art institutions, there's a student or a professorial relationship to this school, and it's compensated, there's a transactional thing and all this. But how do we actually move beyond that? And I think that helps to address something I was loving that you were talking about Guillermo Gómez-Peña and James Luna, both of whom have been residents and events we've done, right? And the idea of relationships that are outside of the binary that deals with mainstream and the racialized other, right? But between and amongst, particularly around Indigenous and other racialized communities, and how this can function as one element to create connectivity. At least that's what I was getting out of the very inspiring talk, right? Just how can we connect better with care and compassion that's not just part of our duty in some ways. So it is dharmic in some ways, but a very different form of it, right?
No, I mean, I think it is actually. I really do. Like, I'm glad that you use that term, because I think that, this is also like an internal South Asian conversation a little bit, but it isn't, because, people around the world do use these concepts now and sometimes abuse them as well. And I think that is our dharma. We need to, especially so like as South Asians in the diaspora, for example, I can't just talk about, I need to be alert to the needs of the Indigenous people here in Los Angeles, and then turn around and like not be concerned about the abusive leaders of tribal communities in India, right? I mean, that's something that I see a lot in my community of diaspora people, is that, we might be all Black Lives Matter on this side and then not be talking about colorism as it affects us. And so that's where I think my perspective has always been, I'm not here and then there, I'm here and there at the same time. And the internet allows that to happen. So where my mind was already simultaneously in LA, New York, and New Delhi, right now, right, like my phone's there too. So I have more of a connection to that. And I've been able to educate myself because I have those connections. So I can learn from people of my own generation, senior generations and junior generations in India. I can be in contact with people in Canada, where I think the conversation is a bit different in a number of ways. People in Latin America, people in Africa, right? We can be in solidarity, like the Afro-Danish and Afro-Swedish people that I meet, who have a very hard time advancing a conversation about Black identity because it's not admissible in Scandinavia. And they're treated as anomalous a lot of the time, right? So we're able to find that strength. The internet can be extremely valuable. So, for example, some years ago, Hito Stereo wrote about how refusing to participate in social media would be our way to resist its commodification and homogenization tendencies and the total surveillance and the synthesis of community in the absence of an actual community. And yet, obviously, during the quarantine, people were forced to be online. There's no way to drop out when there's no other existence possible, right? So then there becomes a question of, well, then how do you disappear in plain sight? How do you subvert by being present? And one of the ways that I do that is I don't live in my little news bubble. I use this opportunity to find out what people are saying and then push the conversation, right? So like I'm always, okay, my mom and all her friends are on my Facebook list. They're going to have to read this like 20th article from Equality Labs. You know, they're just going to have to. Right. So I think that I'm out there, I'm pushing, and I'm saying, and then you're going to have to read this one about the, you know, the needing to stop the Keystone XL pipeline. Right. So those things are together. And I think that's really important. And I've learned, because I didn't always know this. I didn't always think this way. I didn't always understand all these complexities of what my identity represents in the world, or, you know, the nuances of a political system in the United States that really deals with race in terms of white and black Christian people. The rhetorics around land and acknowledgement, right, which are driven by indigenous people. And then this complexity of colorism and caste and privilege within a brown expatriate community, right? All these layers are present, and we have to be sensitive to all of them. It's just super important, I think, to be attuned to, it's intersectionality, right? Plain and simple, it's intersectionality. You got to know where you are in all the different axes that emerge from you.
Great. I've got one more question for you, sort of thinking about the complexities of learning each other's stories, but how inequities are produced in a more complex system, is the Juan Downey work. You know, like what happened after he ceded authority in terms of capturing the footage of the other? And I'm wondering if that's another sort of parable of sorts, is the kind of a redistribution of authorization somehow, or the redistribution of expertise, or the redistribution of who gets to record and who gets to get remembered.
Yeah, I mean, well, that piece is so interesting. I mean, I did write about Downey, so I know something about him,
Yeah.
but I'm not an expert in Downey. But
or perhaps
I love Laughing Alligator because, so he does a few things, right? He gives the camera to the Yanomami, but he also makes his teenage daughter the narrator, and I think she's his stepdaughter, right? So she's like dragged down there basically by her parents to go do this thing. And she becomes like the broadcaster, the kind of contextual voice. So he cedes authority in all these different ways. He cedes his patriarchal authority, he cedes his colonization authority, but ultimately he gets editing privilege. He puts his name on it. So he's not fully ceding authority. And I think a lot of times artists today would consider that to be enough. And where Downey in the 1970s and the early 80s, right, like that was as far as he could take it. I wouldn't say that that's where the conversation ends. I think that that's as far as Downey was able to run with the ball, right? So what happens after that? Well, you know, I mean, I think what happens after that is indigenous filmmakers, right? People who come from a community and tell that story. But the channels for getting distribution to them are what are really our bane of our existence. Is anyone can get a camera now, anyone can tell a story, but are we going to see and hear all of those stories? Are we going to recognize them all in a cacophony of information, and everyone's self-reporting and everyone's self-mythologizing too, right? So I don't know, there's this film, I think the filmmaker's name was Joao Andrade. It's called O Peixe, and it was brought to my attention by the artist Diedrich Brackens, who's an LA, African-American artist in LA, who makes really wonderful textile-based works. They're sort of textiles that function kind of like paintings. And this work is these indigenous fishermen in the Brazilian Amazon who have a ritual where they fish and then they capture the fish and then they hold and caress the fish and stroke them gently while they gasp their last breaths and try to ease their passage into the next world. So it's this kind of like, yes, I have to kill you and eat you, but I really care about you.
Mhm.
And they hold the fish and they hug it, right? And it's like, it's so poetic and beautiful. I feel like work like that, when it circulates, when it enters into the contemporary art system and it becomes available, it can just transform your consciousness just watching these fish breathe, right? I mean, it's about how do you get that, right?
Yeah.
I know about it because Diedrich knows about it, because a curator that he's close to knew about it, right? And then it turns out it's there on the internet. Anyone could find it.
Mhm.
Right, but this is the conundrum, is like, it's still, you find it by word of mouth, just like you always did,
Mhm.
right? And the algorithm can't really find it for you, right? There's no substitute for human research. This is really the pitfall of artificial intelligence across the board.
Mhm.
It can be a research aid and a research tool, but it cannot produce meaningful knowledge.
Yeah. The heart, right?
Yeah, I mean, or also just like the application, right? Everything is abstract to it.
Mhm.
It doesn't have the grounding. It doesn't poop beans.
Yeah. That's right. Well, excellent. Any final comments? It is an hour. We've kept you
We've
for
covered
more
a
than an hour
lot.
and a
I
half.
think people
Yeah.
have been very patient, so I think we can wrap. But I will just say, I mean, I write about and think about these subjects a lot. So I have a number of pieces that I've written, and if you want to hear more on these thoughts, you can go to my website and take a look at some of the pieces. The most recent one was for Los Angeles Review of Books. It's called An Ethic of Caring Beyond the Human. And that was published last summer, August of 2020. There's a piece that I wrote for the Brooklyn Rail that I read a little of. That was the Toy Purina piece that's on the website. And then I wrote something that actually just came out today for Panorama. That was part of a colloquium that they did that was all about care. And so that's sort of along the lines of the piece that I wrote for Extra last summer, which was called Unstable Connections. Also about teaching online and how do you care for a community of students in a crisis as we were in. So those are just some different areas. If you want to read more about, my thinking on the subject, you can start there. And yeah, keep in touch. I always respond to emails if people email me through my website. So, please do. And best wishes for the rest of this amazing program.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, we're looking forward to reading more. I plopped in the chat your website. So to be continued.
Yes, indeed. Well, thanks again.
Perfect. Thank you. See you all later.
Okay,
Thanks.
take care. Bye.